By the late 1930s, modern conflict demanded a definitive answer to the threat of airborne terror. As Britain prepared its strategic air campaign against Nazi Germany, the Luftwaffe found itself exposed. Despite its reputation for technological dominance, the German Air Force desperately lacked a coherent night defense system. Early warning systems were rudimentary, relying on limited radio transmissions and coordinated searchlight beams. This infrastructure gap forced the initiative onto visionary officers like Major Wolfgang Falk. Falk recognized that the defense of the Reich could not rely on outdated visual tactics. He and his contemporaries fought against the pervasive myth that the Luftwaffe was an unstoppable, technologically superior force. The truth, in those nascent days of air defense, was far more fragile. They were pioneers, often flying day fighters like the Messerschmitt 110. These aircraft were already deemed too slow for the day war. The pilots attempted to intercept heavy bombers in total darkness. Success was born of sheer audacity and ingenuity. Oberleutnant Streib demonstrated the potential, achieving the night fighter arm's first confirmed kill on July 20, 1940. He downed a heavy Armstrong Whiteworth Whitley bomber. Other pilots, like Lieutenant Mulders, discovered essential new operational tactics. Mulders realized that by climbing to extreme altitudes, the dark veil of the atmosphere would vanish like a wraith. This revealed a quite fantastic starry sky and vastly improved visibility. These pioneering seat-of-the-pants victories proved the concept was viable. On September 30, 1940, the decision was formalized. Germany would develop night fighting on a grand scale, leading to the establishment of dedicated defense units. For the young men recruited to this specialized arm, the reality was one of intense, immediate anxiety. The training was brutal, and the stakes were impossibly high. Lieutenant Wilhelm Jonen, the narrator, began his instruction at Stuttgart-Echterdingen in May 1941. It was here, during his first solo night flight and landing, that the sheer terror first settled in. He was forced to rely on invisible forces and frail machinery. The cockpit of the heavy Me-110 was a lonely place. The ground was a smear of black beneath him. He relied utterly on the professionalism of his wireless operator, Gefreiter Rissop, a voice of calm guidance in the dark. The training culminated in the ultimate test, the first operational deployment. Jonen's early missions underscored the precariousness of the fight. The German pilots were still flying the same crates they had used since 1940. They were equipped with only the most basic night vision aids. These aids were sometimes mocked as nothing more effective than vitamin pills and raw Swedes. The pilots were utterly dependent on ground control. These distant voices of men called Meteor or Wolfsburg struggled to vector the fighters onto enemy courses. This was a desperate gamble against the technological curve. Pilots were not masters of the night. They were lost sheep clinging to searchlights as to a straw when clouds swallowed their instruments. This was the intense, uncertain reality of night combat at its inception. The early defense was built on the strained nerves of young men, minimal equipment, and the hope that luck would hold out just long enough to see the dawn. The air war against Germany was no longer a sporadic nuisance. It was a campaign of attrition designed to crush industry and morale. Following the 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in 1942, the old, restrictive system of night defense was rendered obsolete. The terrifying firestorms that would soon engulf Hamburg only confirmed this failure. Allied formations were flying in confident, massive streams, executing a goose step through the night sky. The German fighter arm was too slow, too clumsy, and too blind to stop them. The technological answer, championed by General Major Kammhuber and his staff, finally arrived. This was the deployment of the Liechtenstein radar apparatus. This system, though crude in appearance with its long jutting aerials, fundamentally transformed the night war. The aerials were nicknamed the barbed wire. The Lee radar, operating on ultra-short waves, allowed the German night fighters to become independent hunters for the first time. Pilots were no longer lost sheep, clinging to the faint gleam of distant searchlights. They were now directed by the precise feedback of the cathode ray tube. This tube provided the distance, altitude, and position of the enemy up to 4 kilometers away. This technological leap immediately shattered Allied confidence. The massive, coordinated bomber formations that had once flown with impunity now found themselves in a death march. Night fighters, assembled in close formation over coastal beacons, were vectored directly into the heart of the bomber stream. German pilots, who had previously felt the futility of chasing ghosts in the dark, now experienced a brief, exhilarating period of technological supremacy. The psychological shift was profound. The tension remained, but it was now the tension of the stalker, not the hunted. In the darkened ready rooms, where crews sat acclimatizing their eyes, conversation remained hushed. The black Me-110s waited outside like ghosts, yet when the alarm bell sounded, the men who scrambled for the cockpit felt an immediate professional competence that had been lacking before the radar's arrival. The success of the new system relied entirely on the relationship between the pilot and his wireless operator. This operator was the man staring intently at the flickering blue band of the cathode ray tube. It was a brutal, close-range fight dictated by the machine. The pilot would close in, guided by the operator's calm, precise readings. This continued until the bomber's dark silhouette was finally visible against the night sky. The opening of fire was often instantaneous, transforming the enemy aircraft into a blazing torch in moments. But the price of this new lethality was measured in experienced crews. The technological advantage, while granting victories, did not diminish the inherent danger of aerial combat. Every mission was a gamble, a test of nerves against the enemy's desperate rear gunners. Even the most successful night fighter crews, like that of Oberfeldwebel-Wegener, could be lost in a flash of retaliatory fire. They plunged to earth like a comet with a long tail. The shock of such losses rippled through the squadrons. It was a constant grim reminder that technological superiority was only temporary insurance against fate. This shared pathological proximity to death forged a fierce camaraderie that transcended rank. The memoirists of the night fighter arm often pushed back against the fanatical stereotype. They revealed men who dealt with the strain through dark humor. They warned each other to avoid a sticky end in the drink without a rubber dinghy. Amidst the chaos of the high-stakes technological race, the pilots found a deeper shared solace. Pilots trust in God far more than people would believe, one recalled. They clung to faith as much as to their newly acquired radar screens. For a brief, critical period between 1942 and 1943, the Liechtenstein apparatus stabilized the defense of the Reich. It bought precious time and inflicted catastrophic losses on the British. But in the relentless, escalating arms race, time was the one thing Germany could not afford to waste. The balance of power, once tilted by a single technological breakthrough, was already precarious. It was waiting for the inevitable Allied counterstroke. The destruction of Hamburg in July 1943 was a profound turning point. It was orchestrated by the enemy's simple yet devastating countermeasure of tinfoil strips. This was not merely a military defeat, it was a technological failure that revealed the flaws in the Reich's air defense strategy. The sophisticated Liechtenstein radar, which had granted German pilots brief supremacy, was instantly rendered deaf and blind. The shock rippled through the central command of the night fighter arm, the brain of the defense. The colonel watched the large frosted glass panels showing the night fighter sectors become useless smears of confusion. The larger, ground-based radar systems, like the massive Wurzburg-Riese, were equally neutralized. This technological ambush forced a feverish, desperate scramble to catch up. Engineers rushed the development of the SN2 radar. This new system was designed to operate on multiple, ultra-short waves, allowing frequencies to be changed when jammed. But this was only a stopgap measure. Could German ingenuity possibly keep pace with the Allied war machine? The true symbol of Allied technological superiority was the de Havilland Mosquito. Faster by 140 miles per hour than the aging Me-110s, the Mosquito was a deadly threat. It was equipped with advanced radar that could detect German aircraft at 5 miles. The Mosquito became, in the words of pilot Wilhelm Jonen, the night fighter's greatest plague. These swift wooden predators specialized in trailing the bomber stream. They were ready to pick the German night fighters out of the bomber stream like currants out of a cake. Pursuit of returning Allied bombers, once a source of easy kills, became pointless once their payload was dropped. The technological deficit was compounded by strategic error. Hitler's fatal delays prevented the implementation of superior designs. The plans for the turbojet Me-262 had existed since 1941. The aircraft was only just entering service and then often deployed incorrectly as a bomber rather than a defensive interceptor. By 1943, the German fighter arm was forced to shoulder an unsustainable double burden. The USAAF's introduction of mass daylight raids, escorted by fast long-range P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, was the catalyst. Night fighter crews, the most highly trained and irreplaceable personnel in the Luftwaffe, were compelled to fly by day as well. Their Me-110s and Ju-88s were designed for the heavier, slower work of night interception. They had hardly any chance against the fast US escort fighters. The resulting losses of veteran pilots were catastrophic and irresponsible, crippling the defense structure beyond recovery. The ultimate test of endurance came in the winter of 1943 to 1944 during the massive Battle of Berlin. The capital became a gigantic battlefield, night after night transforming the Reich into an inferno. The city's defense was a chaotic spectacle, utilizing the towering flak defenses and a sea of searchlights. This created a grandiose fireworks display. Pilots flew into a maelstrom of red, yellow, and green tracers. Enemy bombers exploded mid-air, showering the sky with a bright-colored rain of gleaming confetti. The constant bursting of flak shells, the acrid stench of gunpowder, and the relentless pressure severely tortured the pilots' nerves. They pushed themselves to the limit, achieving phenomenal bursts of success. The braids, and in Demi Donningsatu of gunpowder, one crew recorded 4 confirmed Lancaster kills in 45 minutes on a single night. But the personal cost was immense. They returned half-dead with exhaustion only to face the next mission. Amidst the chaos as the sky over the capital glowed with a blood-red glow, a grim realization settled over the most experienced German airmen. The overwhelming scale of the destruction made the truth inescapable. Individual heroism and technological brilliance could not stem the tide. As one pilot articulated, witnessing the relentless devastation of his homeland, the hour of victory had passed. He knew Hitler only wanted to gain time. Even those who had stared death in the face and survived, like the narrator, understood the futility. Jonan had been pulled from a burning wreck and endured the slow, agonizing recovery from severe burns. Yet, duty demanded they continue flying. They were men of fidelity to flying and to comradeship. They were now locked in a bitter struggle where the only remaining goal was to preserve the fatherland for as long as possible. The storm clouds were darkening the sun. The collapse of the Eastern Front in late 1944 was a military retreat and a fragmentation of the entire defense structure. German night fighter units were forced into chaotic, desperate redeployments. The speed of the Allied advance and the sheer exhaustion of the Luftwaffe meant that command structure was being rebuilt on the fly. Leadership was now led by men scarcely old enough to shave. The narrator, now a Hauptmann and squadron commander, at the age of 22 embodied the terrible casualty rates. His promotion highlighted the desperate need for leadership, even as the war became a foregone conclusion. New operational zones, like the plains around Novi Sad, Hungary, were defined by overwhelming logistical shortages. There was also the omnipresent danger of partisan activity. The Puszta, peaceful and golden by day, became a zone where hell was let loose by night. Crews were forced to fly with Tommy guns and 3 days' provisions. They were prepared to destroy their uniforms if forced down to avoid capture and murder. Even the simple act of landing became an ambush. Partisans fired from the cover of maize fields, forcing mechanics and pilots alike to return fire into the darkness. Tactical success, when it came, was ephemeral. The pilots became masters of identification. They were trained to distinguish the subtle engine stagger of the American Mitchell bomber from the similar silhouette of the friendly Do-217. A moment of hesitation or misidentification could lead to the tragic destruction of our brothers. Yet, even amidst the violence of interception, the human element of the conflict could shatter the ideological barrier. Following the successful shoot-down of a Russian Mitchell B-5, the narrator encountered the surviving pilot could shatter intivations of Redovid. This was a wounded Russian colonel. This man was the personification of the Eastern threat. Yet in the quiet exchange between two men who had just tried to kill one another, the political hatred dissolved. The colonel understood the German pilot's reluctance to shoot down a defenseless target. He pressed the narrator's hand in a poignant, shared gesture of humanity that transcended the brutal requirements of war. But that moment stood in stark contrast to the pathological paranoia of the regime they served. The pilots, fighting daily for the fatherland, were simultaneously operating under the shadow of its internal tyranny. The narrator's recent arrest and the subsequent Gestapo action were ordered by Himmler himself. His family had been held under arrest in filthy and stinking cells. They endured disgusting food and relentless interrogation. Their crime was simply that a pilot had been forced to land on neutral Swiss soil. The frontline reality was one of constant, brutal sacrifice. Meanwhile, high political machinations treated the lives of its most valuable airmen and their families as expendable tools in a power struggle. This disconnect was violently underlined when the overwhelming power of the Allied air offensive finally caught up to the fragmenting defense. The American bombing raid on the Novi Sad airfield on September 6 demonstrated the utter vulnerability of Germany's forward positions. Despite the frantic 5-minute evacuation order, the base was annihilated. Waves of silver birds like bright fish rained down destruction. They transformed their doomed eyrie into a lunar landscape. The ultimate symbol of this too-late technological desperation was the Me-262 jet fighter. The plans for this revolutionary aircraft had existed since 1941. Only now was it entering service. The narrator had experienced its incredible power firsthand. He felt the sensation of being shot into the sky, achieving speeds that promised to restore air superiority. Yet, its deployment was fatally hampered by Hitler's strategic errors. More critically, it was hampered by its immense vulnerability on the ground. The jet age was stillborn. The Liebheim airfield, a crucial technical hub, had been carpet-bombed by American formations. The hangar that housed the new jets was reduced to a blazing heap of ruins. The technological future had been destroyed before it could take flight. This confirmed that against the overwhelming industrial might of the Allies, individual bravery and even revolutionary design was simply too late to change the course of the war. By April 1945, the war was no longer a campaign of tactical maneuvers. It was a headlong, chaotic scramble toward oblivion. The last flash before the end began as American tanks pressed relentlessly toward Ulm and the gates of Munich. While the remnants of the German forces retreated in disarray, Joseph Goebbels' voice continued to ring out from the loudspeakers. He echoed the pathological denial of the regime, still prophesying final victory. This propaganda stood in stark, murderous contrast to the reality faced by the Luftwaffe's exhausted crews. The technological dominance of the Allies was now absolute. It was symbolized by the British de Havilland Mosquito. These fast, silent wooden predators specialized not only in hunting the German fighters in the sky, but also in attacking them at their most vulnerable moment. Landing, every approach to an airfield, often lit by nothing more than improvised petrol lamps, was fraught with the possibility of a swift, invisible ambush. The psychological pressure was nearly unbearable. Returning from a final, desperate raid over the burning city of Würzburg, the Hauptmann guided his Me-110 toward a makeshift runway. Phosphorus canisters had turned the streets into rivers of white heat. Fuel was critically low, and the sky was dark and threatening. The tension in the cockpit was a living thing, broken only by the ground crew's frantic preparations. In that desperate moment, a fatal error occurred. Despite the strict silence required to avoid detection, an over-eager mechanic on the ground flashed a white lamp or a green torch. The response from the darkness was instantaneous and terrible. The increasing, high-pitched whistle of diving mosquitoes signaled an attack that was already underway. Traces erupted from the night, striking the German aircraft. The Hauptmann and his crew, Mahl and Grashoff, scrambled to escape the cabin. Flames darted from the port engine, the metal screeching as the rounds tore through the fuselage. The attack lasted only seconds but left a crater of destruction. The narrator's Me-110 was destroyed, along with 2 other machines. One comrade lay dead, another wounded. The British mosquitoes, having executed their impudent, precise strike, vanished back into the night. It was a vicious final confirmation that the enemy owned the sky, even the airspace directly above the German runways. Later, the narrator's driver, Vacha, surveyed the wreckage and the survivors. "Herr Hauptmann," he said simply, "once more you've got away with it." Amidst this collapse, morale was a constant, fragile concern. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the wing managed to secure a small, precious hoard of supplies. They found food and brandy from the remnants of a depot in Ingolstadt. The commander felt compelled to address his remaining troops. The speech he delivered was heavy-hearted, devoid of any mention of victory or even hope. He focused instead on the only things they had left. He spoke of the past glories of their night-fighting days, but he acknowledged that they were now facing a difficult path into an obscure future. He urged them to hold fast to the unbreakable bond forged in the night sky. "Preserve your comradeship," he insisted, "and remember our fallen." It was a farewell more than a command. It was a recognition that fidelity to each other was the only remaining duty. The definitive end came swiftly. On April 28th, the final command arrived from Division. The last operational flight for Night Fighter Wing No. 6 took place on the night of April 30th. The heavy-hearted final duty was to blow up the remaining aircraft. The explosions that ripped through the airfields were not the sound of enemy bombs. They were the deliberate, symbolic destruction of their own fighting capacity. This signaled the irreversible physical collapse of the German defense. As the war ended, and the men dispersed to face an uncertain world, the commander looked back on the 6 years of technological terror. He knew that technology had exponentially increased the destructive potential of human conflict. This included everything from the Liechtenstein radar to the turbojet, and from the 4-engined bomber to the Mosquito. The storm clouds had darkened the sun, and heavy shadows lay over the country. Yet, he concluded, the men had gone the same way together to the bitter end. They preserved 3 intangible values in their hearts. These were fidelity to flying, wartime comradeship, and the proud memory of their night-fighting days. This legacy, however, came with a profound final lesson. The massive industrialized technological scale of modern war demanded a fundamental shift in human attitudes toward conflict. The world had armed itself with instruments of annihilation. To survive, humanity needed to lay aside its blood-stained armor. The alternative was oblivion.